Thanksgiving used to feel like a performance in my family, all elegant table settings and polite smiles, masking quiet dismissals. But nothing prepared me for the year I showed up and saw 12 chairs, 11 names, and mine missing. I sat in a folding chair no one noticed, brought a pie no one touched, and watched my mother toast the daughter. She was proud of my sister. Then I stood, said thank you for finally saying it out loud, and turned to leave. That's when I heard the knock. A voice I hadn't heard in years called my name. I turned and there stood my former student, now a California state senator, holding a bottle of wine and asking for me by name. I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house in Sacramento with a foil-covered pumpkin pie cooling on the passenger seat and a knot tightening in my stomach. The late afternoon light painted the trees amber and gold, but it did nothing to settle the unease creeping through me. Thanksgiving had always been a complicated production in our family. Plenty of smiles and polite conversations, but always with an undercurrent. One that only I seemed to feel. I sat for a moment before getting out, watching my sister's sleek black SUV already parked neatly by the curb. Julia was always early. Always prepared. Always approved of. I grabbed the pie, balanced it carefully in both hands, and walked up the familiar steps. The front door was slightly ajar. I knocked anyway, out of habit more than expectation. No one answered. I nudged it open with my shoulder. Inside, the scent of sage and turkey drifted through the hallway. Laughter erupted from the kitchen, my mother's voice rising above the rest like she was hosting a radio show. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me with a soft thud. The sound barely registered amid the buzz. No one looked up. I cleared my throat and held up the pie as I entered the kitchen. Hi, Mom. I brought dessert. My mother barely glanced over her shoulder. Her Chardonnay glass hovered midair as she waved vaguely toward the counter. There's already dessert. Just leave it there. I set it down next to a store-bought pecan tart and something Julia probably had delivered from that fancy bakery she loves downtown. I watched for a moment as my mother leaned into Julia, laughing at something touching her arm like she was a celebrity. Julia looked up briefly, saw me, and gave me a tight-lipped smile. Then she turned back to whoever was asking about her new promotion at Westlake Pharmaceuticals. She was glowing. She always did in this house. I stood awkwardly, unsure of where to go. My Uncle Jim was nursing a beer by the fireplace. My cousins were already parked on the living room, couches, faces buried in their phones or gossiping about someone from work. My father sat in his usual armchair, thumbing through a newspaper, glasses perched on his nose, saying nothing. I hovered by the staircase for a few more seconds, then walked slowly into the dining room when I heard my aunt calling out that dinner was ready. The table was stunning. My mother always did Thanksgiving like a magazine spread. China with gold trim. Folded napkins like swans. Wine glasses already half full. Candles lit. There were 12 seats. I stepped closer, squinting at the place cards. Julia, Matt, Brandon, Uncle Jim, Aunt Carol, Dad, Mom. My name wasn't there. I looked again, slower this time. My breath caught for a second. Maybe they forgot. Maybe it was an oversight. But no one said anything. No one looked around and said, "Hey Nat, where's your seat?" or, "Oh shoot, we must have missed it." No one acknowledged me at all. The only extra chair I could see was a metal folding one leaned against the far wall. I walked over quietly, dragging it toward the end of the table. The sound of metal scraping against hardwood made a long, uncomfortable screech that should have broken the conversation. It didn't. I unfolded the chair and placed it at the corner, far from the centerpiece and even farther from my mother's seat at the head. I sat down, smoothed my napkin over my lap, and reached for the bread basket. No one passed it to me. The conversation flowed without a beat. Julia was describing her latest trip to Seattle for a corporate retreat. Someone asked if she was going to be promoted again before the fiscal year. Mom beamed like she'd just won an award herself. I nibbled at the edge of my roll, chewing slowly. The food tasted fine, but it sat heavy in my mouth. I looked down the table, my eyes catching the polished silver, the perfect lighting, the curated wine pairings. I remembered setting that same table as a teenager, measuring inches between the fork and plate under my mother's watchful eye. I looked at her now. She didn't glance in my direction once. My father finally spoke, asking Julia how Brandon was doing in middle school. Julia launched into a monologue about STEM club and leadership seminars. Everyone listened like it was a TED Talk. I pushed a green bean around my plate. My hand brushed the pie dish I had brought in earlier, now exiled to the sideboard behind me. Untouched. The weight in my chest was familiar. It pressed down slow and steady. I'd felt it before many times. At birthday dinners when only Julia's achievements were toasted. At Christmas when my gifts were practical and hers extravagant. Even at my own graduation dinner, which was shortened because Julia had a brunch to attend the next morning. I forced a smile and took a sip of water, the glass shaking slightly in my hand. My fork clinked against the plate louder than I intended. Still no one looked up. The chair beneath me felt colder than the rest. Maybe it was. Maybe that was the point. I sat quietly invisible and waited for the part I hated most. The toast. My mother stood slowly, raising her wine glass with a polished smile, the kind she wore when hosting or when she was about to say something performative. The room settled around her like it always did. Forks lowered. Conversations paused. Even the candles seemed to flicker more quietly. She looked down the table, eyes lingering on Julia. "Let's raise a glass to someone who has made us all proud this year," she said. "A woman who balances career and motherhood with grace. Who just landed that big promotion at Westlake and still makes time to bring the best cranberry chutney. My daughter Julia." Applause broke out. Not thunderous, but enough to feel rehearsed. I glanced down at my plate, forcing my face to remain neutral as Julia waved a hand like it was all so embarrassing. She wasn't embarrassed, she was glowing. My mother clinked her glass with Julia's and then with her own as if they were the only two people in the room. I took a sip of water, my throat dry. The toast passed like a gust of cold wind through my chest. And just like that, I was back in that other dining room 3 years earlier in the same house, but a very different season. The one where everything shifted. It was late spring. My father Frank had just come home from an appointment at UC Davis Medical Center. He was quiet more than usual, his steps uncertain. When I asked what the doctor said, he didn't answer. My mother was the one who finally told me he had degenerative disc disease. It was already affecting his mobility, and they'd need to prepare for a long recovery process. We should all sit down and figure out a plan, she had said, so we did. Around this very table. Julia and Matt sat on one side, Brandon playing a game quietly on an iPad. I remember thinking how removed they seemed. My mother had papers spread out, possible care facilities circled in blue ink. She hated uncertainty. She preferred logistics. Julia was the first to speak. "Mom, I wish I could take some of this on, but with work and Brandon's soccer schedule, it's just not realistic. Matt has conferences in Chicago through July." My mother nodded sympathetically. "Of course, honey. I understand." Then her eyes turned to me. "Natalie, you're not tied down. No kids. No husband. And summer's coming. You'll have more flexibility than the rest of us." She said it kindly. That made it worse. Like I was a free space on the family calendar easily penciled in. I looked at my dad. He didn't meet my eyes. "I can do it," I said. "I'll take a leave. I can shift some of my classes online. I've done it before." Julia nodded, relieved. My mother moved on to the next topic, budgeting for home modifications. No one asked if I was okay with it. No one asked what I might be giving up. That summer was one of the hardest of my life. I moved back in for nearly 10 months. I drove Dad to physical therapy twice a week. I learned to cook low-sodium meals, bought a whiteboard to chart his exercises, and even installed handrails in the bathroom with YouTube tutorials and a borrowed drill. I taught 3 virtual classes from the guest room, grading papers, between medication reminders. There were days he couldn't sit up without help, and I was the only one there. Julia called once a week. My mother mostly managed the bills. I was the one who saw him cry in pain. I was the one who pulled him off the floor when he slipped in the hallway. We never talked about it. When he finally walked without a cane again, they thanked the doctors. I packed up my things in silence one Saturday and returned to my apartment in Midtown. My desk at school had a layer of dust on it. My nameplate was gone. Someone had moved it to the storage closet. I didn't bring any of it up. Not when Julia got promoted. Not when my mother told me she wished I'd find something more stable than teaching. Not even when she said during a phone call last Christmas that Julia was the one holding this family together. I blinked back into the present as the clinking glasses settled and conversation resumed. Julia was now recounting a story about her team at Westlake winning some award for brand alignment. My uncle asked about the bonus. She laughed and said she hadn't decided what to spend it on yet. Maybe a new SUV. I pressed my napkin against my lap, suddenly too warm. Dad hadn't spoken yet. He just sat there listening, his fork still untouched. I wondered if he remembered. If he remembered the nights I stayed up with him through back spasms, the mornings I fed him before my first Zoom class, the way I carried him through that year so no one else had to rearrange their lives. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. Either way, no one said thank you. I reached for my water again. The glass felt heavier this time. Outside, I could see the porch light flicker on as the sky turned lavender. My pie sat untouched on the sideboard. Julia's bakery cake had been devoured. People were already asking for seconds. My mother laughed again, high and sharp, and I felt something in my chest tighten like a fist. It had been 3 years since that spring. 3 years since I stepped into the role no one wanted. And now, here I was sitting in a folding chair, not even worthy of a name card. I looked at the people around the table. My family, my blood. And for the first time in a long time, I realized how far away from them I really was. Julia dabbed her mouth with her napkin and leaned in like she'd just remembered something delightful. Oh, and guess what? Brandon just got into the advanced STEM program at St. Augustine Prep. They only take the top 2%. I mean, he's just in 7th grade, but his science project on solar desalination was a huge hit at regionals. Aunt Carol clapped her hands and murmured something about genius genes. My mother looked so pleased it was almost comical. Of course he did, she said. With you and Matt as parents, how could he not? Matt, sitting beside her, offered a modest smile. Julia beamed, clearly enjoying the spotlight. My mother placed a hand over hers and gave it a little squeeze like she was passing down a crown. That's incredible, I said, trying not to sound small. Julia tilted her head in my direction, generous enough to include me in her success. He's been working really hard, she said. We're looking into early entry high school credits next semester. Maybe AP Bio if the school lets him. My mother turned to her with the full attention of someone watching a royal speech. That boy is going places, she said proudly. I swear he's going to cure cancer or run the CDC by the time he's 20. I took a sip of wine, letting it settle before I spoke. One of my students just got a full ride to Yale, I said. She was waitlisted last year, but she rewrote her personal essay after we had some long talks during office hours. She wrote about growing up undocumented, about the fear of being invisible. It was one of the most honest things I've read in years. The room went still for a half second. Then my mother laughed, not unkindly but dismissively, like someone brushing lint from a blouse. That's nice, but she's not family. Why get so worked up over kids that aren't even yours? I felt the heat rise in my chest. They're my students, I said. I spend more time with them than most people spend with their own families. They matter. Julia was already refilling her wine glass. Well, sure, but there's only so much you can do. Some kids just make it because they're wired that way. I looked at her, trying to find a crack in her polished confidence. I found none. It's not wiring, I said, it's effort. It's someone telling them they're worth something. My mother waved her hand like she was brushing away a fly. You always get so intense about these things. You pour yourself into everyone else and then act surprised when you're exhausted. I wasn't surprised. I was tired. There's a difference. I looked at my father sitting silently across the table. He was slowly cutting into his turkey, eyes focused on his plate like it held the answer to world peace. Dad, I said gently, do you remember when I brought home that essay about income inequality, the one that won the district award? He looked up for a second, blinked, then nodded slowly. Yes. You hung it on the fridge, I think. I did. You took it down after a week to make room for Julia's wedding photos. He said nothing. The silence clung to the edges of the table like fog. I folded my napkin in my lap to give my hands something to do. Mom turned to Julia again, smiling brightly. "And how's Richard adjusting to the new role? Roosevelt High is a big step up from where he was." "He's doing great," Julia said. "The staff loves him. He's implementing a new discipline policy that's gotten a lot of praise from the district." "That school needed a strong male leader," my mother added. "Someone who isn't afraid to hold kids accountable." My throat tightened. I knew Roosevelt High. I knew what the students looked like. Mostly Black and Latino. Mostly low income. I knew what accountable meant in those contexts. I also knew that no one at the table cared. I didn't say any of that. Instead, I asked, "Is he the same Richard who suspended 3 girls for organizing a protest over the dress code last fall?" Julia stiffened. "That's not fair. He was just following the rules. It got blown out of proportion online." I nodded slowly. "Of course it did." My father reached for the potatoes, still quiet. No one asked how my semester was going. No one asked how my class on systemic bias in education was received, or that I'd been invited to speak at a state educators' conference in February. I might as well have been furniture. I excused myself quietly and stepped out onto the back patio. The air was crisp, almost sharp, and the sky had deepened into that navy blue that only lasts a few minutes before night takes over completely. Inside, I could hear laughter again. Julia's voice high and sure. My mother responding with admiration that she never wasted on me. The house glowed from within, warm and full of people who had already decided what mattered and who didn't. I stood in the dark watching the outlines of my family through the window. And I wondered, not for the first time, what it would take for them to see me. I came back inside through the sliding glass door, the cold still clinging to my sleeves. No one noticed I'd been gone. Julia was passing around her lemon tart, Mom was pouring another round of wine, and Dad had disappeared from the table. I quietly made my way toward the stairs, telling myself I just needed a break. A few minutes upstairs. A moment of silence that didn't make my skin crawl. The hallway still smelled faintly like lavender and lemon polish. My old bedroom door was slightly ajar. The room hadn't changed much. The same twin bed, now perfectly made with a neutral beige comforter. The desk had been cleared, my old books packed away. A guest room now. Or maybe just a room no one entered. I opened the closet to grab the jacket I'd left hanging when I arrived. It wasn't there. I frowned and checked the dresser. The top drawer held a few random hangers, some holiday linens. The second was filled with extra candles and old chargers tangled like seaweed. When I pulled open the bottom drawer, something slid forward. A thick white envelope tucked beneath a stack of unopened mail and coupons from last fall. It was sealed, but the edges were softened like it had been handled more than once. My name wasn't on it. But my father's was. Frank Pierce, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. I turned it over. The return address was Los Angeles. Camila Reyes. I sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly unsteady. Camila. I hadn't seen that name in years. I hesitated, then opened the flap carefully, like it might fall apart if I moved too fast. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Not typed. Written by hand in deep blue ink. The date in the corner read the 10th of September 2025. Dear Mr. Pierce, I hope this letter finds you well. I know it might seem strange to hear from someone you've never met, but I felt it was important that I write to you. Because your daughter changed my life. My name is Camila Reyes. I was one of Natalie's students at Roosevelt High back in 2005. I was the girl who nearly got expelled for writing an essay about gender discrimination in our school's policies. Your daughter stood up for me when no one else would. She fought quietly, persistently, and at personal cost. Because of her, I stayed in school. Because of her, I got a scholarship. Because of her, I believed I was worth something. I'm writing to you today as the newly elected state senator for California's 9th District. I wanted you to know that the person you raised has left a mark on this world far greater than any newspaper headline or award could capture. She saw me when I was invisible. She gave me dignity before I knew how to claim it myself. If you speak to her, please tell her thank you. If she ever wonders whether the work she does matters, let her know it does. Let her know she changed someone's future. With deep gratitude, Camila Reyes, I stared at the paper, the lines blurring slightly as tears welled in my eyes. I read it again and again. Each word hit with the kind of force that made your chest feel both cracked open and full at the same time. He kept this. He didn't throw it away. He kept it. But he never told me. Why? I sat there for several minutes, the letter resting on my knees. I could still picture Camila, 15 years old, her dark eyes sharp with questions she wasn't afraid to ask, her words too big for the walls of our classroom. I remembered the day she came to me after being pulled into the principal's office for what they called inflammatory writing. I remembered walking into that office, sitting down beside her, and refusing to leave until someone listened. She never forgot. I had no idea. The ache in my chest was different this time. Not bitterness. Not frustration. It was something closer to awe, and underneath that a small sliver of pain. Because my father had held on to this piece of me, this proof that I had done something good, and said nothing. Maybe he was waiting for the right moment. Maybe he didn't know how. Or maybe, like me, he was used to letting things go unspoken. I folded the letter back into its envelope and tucked it into my coat pocket. Downstairs, I could hear chairs shifting, the clink of silverware. Probably time for dessert. I took one more glance around the room, the place that had once been mine, and then turned off the light. As I descended the stairs, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked tired, but something in my face had settled. They didn't see me. Not yet, but someone had. And that changed everything. The dessert plates were already being passed around when I returned to the dining room. The lemon tart Julia brought had been sliced with surgical precision, each portion resting on Mom's fine china like it had been plated at a restaurant. My pumpkin pie sat untouched on the sideboard, still covered in foil. Someone had moved it to make room for Julia's centerpiece. A gold-painted cornucopia stuffed with plastic fruit. I took my seat again, quietly folding my napkin into my lap with slow, measured movements. My coat felt heavier now, the envelope inside pressing against my side like a hidden weight. No one looked at me. Not even Dad, who had returned to his seat and was now sipping from a water glass like nothing had happened. Mom stood, wineglass in hand, smile already in place. The room hushed on cue. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge someone truly special to this family, she said, tilting her head toward Julia. My stomach clenched. I already knew. Julia, you are the heart of this home. You've built a beautiful life, a thriving career, you're raising an incredible son, and somehow you still manage to show up for everyone with grace. Your promotion at Westlake isn't just a win for you, it's a win for all of us. I stared at the flickering candle in front of me, watching the wax drip in slow, lazy trails down the stem. No one interrupted. No one shifted. The silence around the table felt anticipatory, as if this had all been rehearsed. You are the daughter every mother dreams of, Mom said with a little laugh. If only Natalie would take a page from your book. A beat of silence followed. My jaw locked. Then a few people clapped. Aunt Carol mostly. Matt gave a small nod. Julia smiled bashfully and reached for her glass, her eyes shining like stage lights had just landed on her. I felt my chair disappear from beneath me, not physically. But emotionally, it might as well have collapsed. The room closed in around me like a fog bank, soft and choking. My pie sat behind me, forgotten. My name had not been spoken. Not once. I stood. The scraping sound of my chair drew a few heads. Thank you, I said, my voice clear and steady, for finally saying it out loud. No one responded. I tucked in my chair slowly and turned toward the hallway. No plates clattered, no one called after me. I walked past the sideboard, past the untouched pie, past the photos on the wall where Julia was framed in gold and I was cropped out of group shots. I reached the front door and wrapped my fingers around the knob. Then I let go. I stood there for a moment, hearing the laughter resume behind me like I hadn't been there at all. My breathing felt tight, like something was pressing just beneath my ribs. I didn't know what I had expected. Maybe not applause. But not nothing. I stepped outside into the night. The air was cool, damp with early winter chill, and smelled faintly of oak leaves and chimney smoke. The porch light buzzed above me, flickering once. I stood at the top of the steps, unsure of where to go. My car keys were in my purse by the coat rack. Inside. I closed my eyes and let the quiet wrap around me like a blanket, colder than it should have been, but somehow honest. Behind me a laugh rose again. Julia's. I took the first step down. Then the second. And then I heard the knock. A sharp, clear rapping on the front door. Not urgent, not impatient. Just steady. I froze, one foot on the last step. From inside, I heard movement. Julia's heels clicked toward the door. A pause. Then the sound of it opening. I turned slowly. There, standing in the glow of the porch light, was a woman in a long charcoal coat, curls pulled into a low bun, a bottle of wine tucked under one arm. Her eyes scanned the room, then landed on me. Natalie, I blinked. Camila. She smiled, stepping forward. I hope this isn't a bad time. Mr. Pierce invited me. I know it's unorthodox showing up like this, but he said it might be meaningful. Julia hovered behind her, visibly confused, her hands still on the doorknob. My mother stood up from the table, brow furrowed. Camila walked past Julia and stepped fully into the entryway. Her coat was damp at the shoulders. She held out the bottle to my mother. I brought red. It's local. Paso Robles. I wasn't sure what was being served. My mother took the bottle mechanically. And you are? Camila turned to her, polite but firm. Camila Reyes. I was one of Natalie's students. From Roosevelt High. A shift passed through the room. Small but unmistakable. My father entered from the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel. She's here, he said softly. Camila smiled at him, then turned back to me. I hope it's okay that I came. I've been meaning to see you. I have some news. Important news. And I couldn't think of a better day to share it. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear. I got elected, Natalie. State Senate. 9th District. I wanted to tell you in person. My breath caught. You. What? She laughed softly, eyes shimmering. I'm the youngest woman ever elected to represent the 9th, sworn in next month. But none of it would have happened if it weren't for you. The dining room was completely silent now. Chairs had stopped shifting. Silverware had stilled. Camila turned toward them, standing tall, steady. This woman changed my life. She fought for me when no one else would. She believed in me before I believed in myself. And I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for her. Her voice rang clear, unwavering. So if you're toasting anyone tonight, it should be her. I looked past her to the faces at the table. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. Julia's wine glass was frozen midair. And for the first time that day, I did not feel small. I felt seen. Camila stepped closer before I could even process it and wrapped her arms around me in a hug, so sure, so full it nearly knocked the air from my lungs. I hadn't been hugged like that in years. Not out of obligation, not out of family duty, but from real connection. I clutched her back, stunned. Her coat was still cold from the night air, her curls smelled faintly of rosemary and wind. When she pulled back, her eyes were glassy. I meant every word she whispered. You saved me, Natalie. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Behind her, the silence in the room was a living thing. I could feel every gaze, every frozen breath. Julia still hadn't sat down. My mother stood halfway between the kitchen and the table, her face pale, eyebrows locked in a slight frown, like the image in front of her was refusing to make sense. Camila turned, eyes scanning the room. Hi, she said, polite, but not soft. I know this is unexpected. I'm sorry if I disrupted dinner. This mattered. My father stepped forward, towel still in hand. He smiled, not broadly, but with a warmth I hadn't seen in him all night. We're glad you came, Camila. She nodded at him, then looked at the rest of the table. My name is Camila Reyes. Some of you might know the election results this week. I was elected to serve California's 9th District in the state Senate. What you probably don't know is that I almost never made it out of high school. Julia blinked, finally lowering her glass. I was 15. Camila continued, and I wrote an essay that challenged the school's dress code. I said it targeted girls unfairly, that it shamed them into silence. I was told it was inappropriate, disruptive. There were talks of suspension, expulsion. She glanced at me. And then someone stood up for me. One teacher. Natalie Pierce. My throat tightened. The envelope in my coat pocket suddenly weighed twice as much. She advocated for me when I couldn't do it for myself. She met with administrators. She rewrote the policy with me. She told me my words had power. And because of that I stayed in school. I went to UCLA. Then Columbia Law. Then I ran. And I won. She smiled, not proud, not smug. Grateful. This woman changed my trajectory. I'm not here to embarrass her. I just thought you all should know the truth about the kind of person she is. No one spoke. Camila turned back to me, gently touched my arm, and I never forgot. My mother cleared her throat. The sound was sharp in the stillness. That's very impressive, she said, forcing a small smile. I'm sure your parents must be proud. Camila tilted her head. They didn't want me to run, actually. They said politics was dangerous. Especially for someone like me. But Natalie believed in me before I had any credentials. Any degree. Any backing. She saw potential when everyone else saw a problem. Julia shifted in her chair, her eyes darting between me and Richard, who stared down at his plate like it might offer an escape hatch. My father stepped closer to Camila. I remember the letter, he said quietly. Thank you for writing it. Camila's face softened. I meant every word. Mom's smile had tightened. Her grip on the wine glass was visibly firmer. Well, she said, maybe we should all sit down again. Let's not let dessert go to waste. Camila shook her head gently. I actually didn't come to eat. I just wanted to stop by. To thank Natalie in person, and to give her something. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded invitation card. Swearing-in ceremony is December 3rd downtown at the Capitol. I want you to come. Front row. She handed it to me. And I want you to stand with me when I take my oath. Because none of this happens without you. I took the card with trembling fingers. My name was written inside under a formal heading embossed in silver ink. It felt surreal. Like being handed a mirror and finally recognizing the person staring back. I swallowed hard. Thank you, I said softly. I don't know what to say. Camila smiled. You don't have to say anything, just show up. You've already done the rest. She turned toward the door, then paused. Congrats on the pie, by the way. The smell alone almost made me stay for seconds. A few people chuckled. But it wasn't the kind of laughter that erased tension. It was the kind that tried to fill a void. Camila opened the front door. The cold rushed back in, curling around our ankles. She looked at my mother, then at Julia. Nice to meet you both. I'm sure you're very proud. Julia gave a shallow nod. My mother pressed her lips into something resembling a smile. And just like that, Camila was gone. The door closed with a soft click. I stood there, card in hand, as the sound of her words echoed inside me louder than any toast I'd ever been given. At the far end of the table, Dad sat back down slowly, his eyes on me now. Really on me. Julia picked up her fork. Mom sipped her wine. No one said a word. I turned to the sideboard, uncovered the pie, and calmly placed it in the center of the table. Then I sat down and waited. No one reached for the pie. The room sat in a strange kind of stillness, the air heavy with something no one wanted to name. My mother stirred her wine with slow, deliberate circles. Julia smoothed the napkin on her lap, even though it wasn't wrinkled. Richard kept his eyes fixed on a spot just to the left of the candle centerpiece. Camila's name still lingered in the air, weighty and undeniable. I cleared my throat gently, not to speak but to mark the moment. And then Julia did the one thing I didn't expect. She looked at me. So, she said, how exactly did you know Camila? You said she was one of your students, but I don't remember you ever mentioning her before. I rested my fork on the edge of my plate. She was in my junior civics class. Back in 2005. Roosevelt High. Julia nodded slowly, then glanced at Richard. That was when you were assistant principal there, right? Richard stiffened. Briefly, he said. Only for a year. I studied him. His voice had that clipped edge he used when he was trying to stay in control. I'd heard it before at family gatherings when someone brought up charter school funding or teacher strikes. He liked being the one with answers. Camila wasn't exaggerating, I said. She wrote an essay critiquing the school's policies, especially the dress code. She said it unfairly targeted girls and sent the wrong message about their bodies. I looked straight at Richard. She was pulled into your office for it. He raised his chin slightly, lips tightening. That essay stirred up a lot of noise. There were concerns about tone, about the appropriateness of the content for a school-wide platform. You suspended her, I said. 3 days, and tried to recommend expulsion. For an essay, Richard shifted in his chair. I followed protocol, he said evenly. The guidelines for student publications were clearly defined. There were rules. I leaned forward. And sometimes the rules are wrong. Julia spoke up, her voice thin. Look, I'm sure it was a complicated situation. I mean, schools have to be careful, especially with public image and parental complaints. Richard wasn't trying to silence her. Camila told me she left that meeting crying, I said, and that no one else stood up for her. Except me. The room went quiet again. The only sound was the faint tick of the wall clock and someone's knife tapping softly against a plate. I didn't do anything radical, I continued. I just sat beside her. I listened. I told her that her voice mattered. And when the administration tried to bury the issue, I helped her rewrite the essay into a public op-ed for the Sacramento Chronicle. It got picked up statewide. My father looked over, his expression unreadable. Julia stared at Richard. Is that true? Richard looked down at his hands. The district wasn't happy about it. They said I should have handled it differently, but by the time I reconsidered, she was already in the spotlight. It would have looked worse to keep pushing. So you backed down because it was convenient, I said. He bristled. I backed down because the school board told me to. Camila's voice rang in my head again. She had said Natalie was the only one who believed in her. I remembered the fire in her writing, the way she refused to apologize for existing. I had never forgotten her. And now, neither had the world. My mother finally spoke, her voice too high and too bright. Well, whatever the details, it all worked out in the end, didn't it? The girl is successful, and Natalie, you helped someone. That's something to be proud of. She raised her wine glass again as if that sealed the matter. Julia didn't lift hers. She was staring at Richard like he'd become a stranger. You never told me any of this, she said quietly. It was a long time ago, Richard replied. She was 15, Julia said, her tone sharper now. You nearly wrecked a girl's future over a dress code. Richard shook his head. It wasn't that simple. Maybe it was, I said. Maybe it's always been that simple. People with power deciding who gets heard and who gets shut down. My mother exhaled loudly. Can we not make this into another lecture? I turned to her. It's not a lecture, it's a memory. One that apparently only matters to me. She gave me a strained smile. All I'm saying is the girl got lucky. Something flickered in my chest. It wasn't luck, I said. It was justice. It was hard work. It was the truth. And the fact that you're calling it luck says everything about how you see people like her. No one moved. I looked around the table at all the carefully neutral expressions, the practiced disinterest. Camila had stood in this room 10 minutes ago and offered them a version of me they had never seen. One they had refused to see. Now they were being forced to sit with it, and so was I. I stood at the kitchen sink later that night, hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing pie plates and wine glasses with slow, methodical motions. The house had grown quieter, the buzz of voices fading into distant murmurs from the living room. Julia and Richard were in the den, whispering sharp sentences under their breath. My mother had disappeared into her bedroom. Only the occasional clink of silverware or the hum of the dishwasher kept me company. The overhead light flickered once. I didn't bother fixing it. I was rinsing a champagne flute when I heard soft footsteps behind me. Need a hand. My father's voice, worn and low like gravel warmed by sun. I glanced over my shoulder. He held a dish towel and looked more settled than I'd seen him all evening. Sure, I said, passing him a plate. He dried it slowly like he was buying time. We stood like that for a minute, working in quiet rhythm. He didn't speak right away. I didn't press him. After the third plate, he cleared his throat. I read Camila's letter the day it arrived, he said. I kept it in my desk drawer. I didn't show your mother. She doesn't always know what to do with things like that. I stopped drying a spoon and turned toward him slightly. Why didn't you give it to me? He paused, folding the towel in half. Because I wanted to wait for the right time. And because I know you. You don't need grand gestures. You just need someone to notice. And I did. I stared at him. His face looked older than usual but softer too. Like something had unknotted behind his eyes. She sent that letter because of you, Natalie. She didn't write it for headlines. She wrote it because you made a difference. That matters. Even if this house sometimes forgets it. I set the spoon down gently in the drying rack. You invited her tonight. He nodded. After I read the letter, I started following her campaign. I watched her speak. I saw how she carries herself. Confident. Fierce. I recognized it. Because I've seen that in you your whole life. My throat tightened. And you just called her. I asked if she'd consider dropping by. I didn't know if she'd say yes. I told her it would mean a lot. Not just to me. To you. She didn't hesitate. He picked up another plate then stopped halfway through wiping it. I know I haven't always said the right things. Or anything at all. But I see what you've done, Natalie. This house, this family, it leans on you more than anyone admits. I leaned against the counter, the cool tile pressing through my sleeves. She changed her life, I said. But I didn't even know. She wrote that letter, and I never got to read it. He placed the clean plate gently on the stack, then looked at me. Because I thought maybe one day I'd be able to give you something better than just the words. He reached into his jacket draped on the back of a chair and pulled out a folded paper. I met with the lawyer last week, he said. Before Thanksgiving. It's not finalized yet, but the paperwork's in motion. The house will be in both our names starting January. I blinked. What you paid to replace the roof 2 years ago. You fixed the heating system last winter. Your mom doesn't remember those things, but I do. You've kept this place standing more than once. Legally, she had the deed. But morally it's yours too. I shook my head, slightly stunned. You didn't have to do that. He looked me square in the eye. You did, and no one asked you to. But you did it anyway. That's what makes you strong. Not because you shout, but because you show up. My eyes stung. I blinked rapidly, trying to will the tears back. I don't need a name on paper, Dad. He gave a soft laugh. Maybe not. But I do. We stood there in silence, surrounded by steam and dishwater and the scent of lemon soap. For the first time in a long while, I felt something inside me loosen. Like a rope finally slackening after years of tension. Thank you, I whispered. You deserve to be rooted somewhere, he said. Not just in responsibility, but in name. In history. The faucet dripped softly. The dishwasher beeped as it finished its cycle. He picked up another glass, then looked at me again. You're the quiet one, Nat. But I hear you now. I just wanted you to know that. I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from crying. A piece of me, one that had been frozen solid for years, finally began to thaw. I poured myself a glass of water and stepped quietly out of the kitchen. The hallway stretched ahead like a tunnel, dimly lit carpet soft beneath my feet. The living room had mostly cleared out. Dad was still at the table sipping tea, Richard and Julia nowhere in sight. My mother's door was cracked open. I meant to pass it. I really did, but then I heard my name. You have to talk to him, Julia. You have to stop your father before he makes a mistake we all regret. My feet froze. Mom's voice was sharp, barely a whisper, but laced with urgency. I stayed still, holding my breath. The door wasn't fully shut, and her words slid through the gap like smoke. If he adds Natalie to the deed, I lose everything. You understand that, right? There was a pause. Julia's voice came next, lower, more tired. It's not about losing anything, Mom. It's about being fair. She's helped with everything around this house for years. She's paid for things you don't even remember. I do, Dad does. That's not the point, my mother said quickly. Once her name is on that house, it's no longer mine. I built this home. I kept it up when your father was laid up after surgery. I managed everything. I'm the one who made this place a home. You weren't alone, Julia said. Oh please. You think Natalie's sacrifices compare to mine? She's never had to raise a child. She's never had a husband to look after. She doesn't understand what real family responsibilities are. My throat tightened. I stepped closer quietly, slowly, staying just outside the line of sight. She's been responsible for all of you, I wanted to say. Julia sighed. Mom, you're not being fair. You're siding with her, I'm not siding with anyone. I'm just tired of pretending she hasn't held this family together more than once. There was a longer pause. You remember Roosevelt? Julia asked. When Richard was almost fired, it was Natalie who rewrote his referral letter. She called in favors. That's the only reason he got the job at Crest Hill. She never told anyone. Not even me. I found out through his old admin assistant. If she hadn't stepped in, your perfect son-in-law would have been out of education for good. That wasn't her place, my mother snapped. It became her place the moment no one else would do it, Julia shot back. A silence followed. Then my mother's voice again, soft but cold. She thinks she deserves this house. After all I've done, she thinks she's owed something. She doesn't think she's owed anything, Julia said, quieter now. But that doesn't mean she deserves nothing. There was a brittle edge in my mother's next words. She's not like you. She never has been. She doesn't belong in this family the same way. The finality of it was so matter-of-fact, so clean that it sliced through me like ice. I leaned against the wall, the water glass in my hand trembling slightly. I should have walked away. I should have turned, gone back to the guest room, locked the door, and buried my head under a pillow. Instead, I stayed. Because I needed to hear it. I needed confirmation that it wasn't all in my head, that the coldness I'd felt for years wasn't imagined. That the absence of affection, of recognition, of simple kindness hadn't been a misinterpretation. It had been policy. And now it was clear. I wasn't a daughter in her eyes. I was a threat. I slipped down the hall before they could hear me, retreating to the guest room, shutting the door behind me softly. I placed the water glass on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers pressing into the quilt that Mom had sewn back when I was in high school. The stitches were neat. Uniform. Detached. The room was silent. My own breath echoed in it. And for a long moment, I just sat there, letting the weight settle. Not anger, not even grief. Just clarity. I finally understood why all those years had felt so uneven. Why my wins never landed. Why my failures were magnified. Why I was always the one standing at the edge of the family portrait, smiling just enough to not be cropped out. She had never planned to include me. Not really. I was a supporting character in her script, someone she allowed to appear when convenient, someone she dismissed when the spotlight turned elsewhere. And Julia. Julia had known. Maybe not all of it. But enough. Enough to carry guilt. Enough to speak the truth behind closed doors, but never at the table. I looked at my reflection in the guest room mirror. My face was still, pale. But something in my expression had changed. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want their apologies. I just wanted to stop needing them to be different. I got up, walked to the small dresser, and pulled open the bottom drawer again. The envelope from Camila still rested inside my coat pocket, but I held it for a moment longer, just feeling the paper between my fingers. That letter wasn't validation, it was truth. I didn't need my mother to believe in me anymore. Someone already had. Someone who had risen from the margins and remembered who helped her climb. I stood by the window, the stars faint behind the haze of suburban streetlights. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone in this house. Not because it had changed, but because I had. The porch was quiet except for the creak of the wooden swing and the distant rustle of wind through the pines lining the street. I sat with a blanket wrapped around my legs, the sky overhead washed in pale gray as dawn threatened to rise. I hadn't planned to come outside again, but the house felt too heavy, too full of words still stuck in the walls. The screen door eased open behind me and Camila stepped out with 2 mugs of coffee, one in each hand. "Thought you might still be up," she said, handing me one. "Thanks." She sat beside me on the swing, crossing her legs, her coat still zipped halfway. We rocked gently for a while in silence, sipping. I used to imagine this porch 100 different ways, she said eventually. But none of those versions had me here, sitting next to you, holding a mug in a house that once made you feel small. I gave her a sideways glance. You always had a way with words. Only because you taught me not to be afraid of them. She took another sip, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. I glanced at it. What's that? An invitation, she said, then placed it gently in my lap. I unfolded it. My name was printed at the top below the seal of the California State Senate. My eyes scanned the page, catching keywords. Advisory Council on Educational Equity. Camila turned toward me. We're forming a new panel to address statewide disparities in public education. Real reforms. Curriculum funding, access, discipline policies. I want you on it. I blinked. Me, you. I let out a dry laugh. Camila. I'm a high school teacher in a mid-sized district. I write lesson plans and grade essays in my sweatpants. I'm not a policymaker. Exactly why I need you, she said. Because you know what's real. You've seen it, lived it. And because you didn't need a podium to change lives, you did it anyway. Quietly, consistently. I looked back at the invitation. My name looked so strange next to words like State Council and Legislative Review. It felt like someone else's paper. She leaned her elbow on the armrest. You once told me that systems only change when people inside them stop being afraid of being inconvenient. I don't remember saying that. You did. Right after I got my first rejection letter from UCLA. You told me to write them back. Not to beg. To clarify. To remind them who they were overlooking. I remembered now. She'd brought the letter into my office, her hands shaking, her mouth tight. I had told her rejection wasn't always the end. Sometimes it was a dare. You believed in me before anyone else did, Camila said softly. This is me returning the favor. We sat there in silence, letting the morning unfold in slow motion. You know it's going to be ugly, I said after a while. The pushback. The politics. She nodded. I expect it. I don't want people who play nice. I want people who do the work. I stared into my coffee for a long time. The idea of it terrified me. But not for the reasons I used to fear things. It wasn't about failure anymore. It was about being seen, and learning how to accept that without flinching. Okay, I said finally. I'll do it. She didn't smile big. Just nodded like we'd made a pact we both understood. A few days later, the Sacramento Tribune ran a full feature. The headline stretched across the top fold: State Senator Camila Reyes honors her former teacher. The photo was candid. Me and Camila outside the house, caught in mid-laughter, my hand on her shoulder, her eyes closed like she was remembering something good. The caption beneath it read, "Some teachers change grades, others change lives." I found the paper on the kitchen table that morning. Someone had left it next to the toaster. My mother stood across the room, arms crossed, staring out the window above the sink. I picked up the newspaper, looked at the front page, then at her. She didn't speak. I folded it and placed it gently on the counter. You read it. She nodded once. Her face gave nothing away. But her hands, still and pale, were clenched tighter than they needed to be. I turned to leave, but her voice stopped me. I didn't know you meant that much to her. I paused, my hand on the door frame. You never asked. She didn't respond. That afternoon I passed by the living room again. The newspaper was gone from the table. Later I opened the side drawer in the credenza to get a coaster. Inside, carefully tucked under old birthday cards and church programs, was the folded paper. The front page still facing out, my picture still visible. She hadn't thrown it away. Not this time. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I stood in front of my second period sociology class, watching as the last of the students filtered in, still shaking off the holiday haze. There was a chill in the air that hadn't quite left, and someone had cracked the window too wide, letting in a gust of Sacramento wind that stirred the flag hanging by the whiteboard. I passed out a worksheet about systemic bias, the kind of topic that usually sparked some lively discussion. But today the room felt different. Quieter. Like they were waiting for something. About 10 minutes in, as I walked between desks, a hand went up in the back row. It was Jackson, a sophomore who rarely spoke unless it was about something he'd researched all weekend. His brow furrowed behind thick glasses. "Can I ask something not about the worksheet?" "Sure," I said. He hesitated. "I saw you on the news. With Senator Reyes. You were her teacher, right?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I was." He leaned forward a little. "Was it weird, like, having someone you taught end up way more famous than you? Did your family even know?" I smiled softly, feeling the room shift again. Everyone, now very interested in my answer. "Yeah, they know. And no, it's not weird. It's incredible." "But weren't they, like, proud?" Jackson asked. "I mean, your name was everywhere." I paused, letting the silence hang just long enough to let the question land fully. "Sometimes," I said, "people don't always say they're proud out loud. But that doesn't mean your worth depends on their words." He frowned, chewing that over. "What does it depend on?" "Knowing it yourself," I said. "And on the people who do see it telling you when it matters." The classroom stayed quiet for a beat, like the moment had hit deeper than expected. Then someone near the window whispered something, and the room gradually slipped back into normal noise. I went back to the front and resumed the lesson, but something lingered in the back of my mind. Camila's face as she'd stood in my parents' house, her voice steady and clear. After the final bell, I stayed behind to finish grading a stack of essays. The halls emptied slowly, lockers slamming, footsteps echoing. I was just logging attendance when the email pinged. From Camila.Reyes@ksenate.gov, subject first guest. "Hey Nat, just confirmed the venue and the time. The list of guests is growing, but you were always going to be the first name on it. I wouldn't be taking that oath if not for you. Hope you'll stand with me when I do. Love, Camila." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not my mother. Not my sister. Not the neighbors who dropped off casseroles when Dad was sick. It was this student who had seen something in me worth honoring. Something permanent. I typed back a simple reply. "I'll be there, always." I shut down my computer, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead humming like distant applause. As I drove home, the sky over Sacramento was painted in shades of lavender and rose. I passed the old middle school Camila used to attend, now updated with solar panels and a digital marquee. I couldn't help but wonder how many girls sat in those classrooms now, wondering if their voices mattered. I got home just after sunset. The house was quiet. My phone hadn't buzzed once since I left school. No messages from Mom. No call from Julia. No apology. No acknowledgement. And yet I wasn't waiting for one. I reheated some leftover lentil soup, wrapped myself in my favorite cardigan, and sat by the window with a book I didn't open. My thoughts were too full for pages. The photo of me and Camila had been reposted over 70,000 times online. Someone had cropped it and added text across the bottom. "Not all heroes wear suits. Some carry lesson plans." Students had tagged me. Old colleagues sent emails. A few even wrote letters. But the one message that mattered most had already come through. A student who had walked into my classroom at 15 and left ready to take on the state. The next morning, I stood by the bulletin board in the teacher's lounge, watching as someone pinned up a printout of the article. A few coworkers glanced at me, some nodded, one gave me a quiet thumbs up. No fanfare, just quiet respect. It was enough. I stepped back into my classroom and looked at the rows of desks, the scuffed tile floors, the faded posters on the wall. The place where so much had begun and where somehow it all kept coming back full circle. I wasn't famous. I wasn't wealthy. But I was remembered. And finally, that felt like more than enough. The leaves had turned a softer gold this year, like even the trees were gentler with their change. It was the day before Thanksgiving 2026, and I was standing in my kitchen stirring cinnamon into sweet potatoes, my playlist humming in the background. The radio host had just finished a segment on women in leadership, and I smiled to myself when Camila's name was the first mentioned. The house smelled like vanilla sage and something faintly smoky from the marshmallows I'd accidentally left in the oven a minute too long. My father was in the living room arranging extra chairs around the table with his usual half-grumble, half-whistle routine. He had insisted we host this year. Said it was time for new traditions. No one else from my family was coming. I hadn't expected them to. After last year, the silence between us had stretched into something permanent. Julia had sent a card in the spring. It said happy birthday. Nothing more. My mother hadn't reached out at all. Not when the news broke about Camila's advisory council. Not when I was interviewed in the Chronicle. Not when the plaque from the district arrived naming me Educator of the Year. And strangely, I was okay with that. This year, the table would be full of people who had chosen to be here. My coworkers, former students, a few neighbors who always waved when I brought in the recycling. Frank had even invited one of his old union buddies who brought homemade cornbread and an endless supply of war stories. By 5 o'clock, the house buzzed with conversation. People balanced plates on their laps, shared stories about first jobs and awkward teenage years. We ate in courses, laughing too loudly and passing dishes too slowly. There was no order, no toasts, no assigned seats. But one chair remained empty. The head of the table. No one sat there, not because it had been claimed, but because it had been saved. At 5:47, just as the pumpkin pie made its second lap around the table, the doorbell rang. I knew it was her before I opened the door. Camila stood there wrapped in a wool coat, curls falling loose around her shoulders, cheeks flushed with wind. She held a bottle of red wine in one hand and a bakery box in the other. "I'm on time this year," she said with a grin. "Barely." She stepped inside, handed me the wine, then held up the box. "From that cafe we used to grade papers in. Remember the cinnamon rolls the size of your head?" I laughed. I hadn't thought about that place in years. She kicked off her boots and looked around the dining room. When she saw the empty chair, her eyes softened. "That for me," I shrugged. "Only if you still want it." She didn't answer. Just walked over and sat down, placing the bakery box in the center of the table like a crown. Then she raised her glass. "To Natalie," she said, her voice clear but not showy. "The one who saw potential where others saw problems. Who made space for people like me long before anyone thought we deserved one. You taught me to speak up. You also taught me when to listen." Everyone followed their voice as a chorus. "To Natalie." I didn't cry. I didn't duck my head. I just smiled, let the warmth wash over me, and took a sip. Dinner went long. People stayed late. My father fell asleep on the couch with a paper plate balanced on his chest, a fork still in his hand. Two of my former students stayed behind to do dishes, arguing over who had better grades in 10th grade. I let them. As I moved to tidy up, Camila joined me at the counter. "You know," she said, "next year's legislative session is going to be brutal." I smirked. "And I assume that's your subtle way of asking if I'm still on board." She shrugged. "Just making sure you're not hiding behind lesson plans again." "Never hiding," I said, just pacing myself. She bumped my shoulder gently. "Fair. But pace faster. I need your voice in that room. They listen to me now, sure, but you make people think." I nodded. We washed the last of the dishes in comfortable silence. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat back at the table. The room was quiet again, the candles melted low. The head chair, the one I never used to sit in, now felt natural under me. Not like a throne. Like home. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded napkin with a smudge of cinnamon and a note scribbled in the corner. One of my students had written it during dinner. "Thanks for being the kind of adult I hope to become." I set it beside my plate, my heart full. The next morning, the Tribune printed a photo from the event. Camila and I in my kitchen, aprons on, cinnamon dust on the counter, both mid-laugh. The headline read, "Not every Thanksgiving has a throne, some just have a chair." Saved with intention, I clipped the article and taped it to my fridge. Next to it was a postcard from a student I'd taught back in 2012. She now worked as a civil rights attorney in Chicago. Another girl who once believed her voice didn't matter. I made breakfast. Simple eggs and toast. Opened the back door to let in the cool morning air. And as I sat down with my coffee, I realized I didn't need a house full of validation. I didn't need my mother's praise or my sister's recognition. I had my chair. And for the first time in my life, it had my name on it. If you've ever felt like the one in the background, the helper, the quiet supporter whose work was taken for granted, I want you to know you are not alone. There are so many of us who've carried more than we should loved without thanks and built spaces for others without asking for anything in return. If you've ever been a Natalie, I invite you to share your story. And if you know someone like Natalie, share this video with them. Let them know they are seen. Let them know they deserve their seat too.